we want to talk about healthcare, as I mentioned, and Chris is here with us from HighPoint Solutions, and they're one of the best in the field. They're all over the country, and we're lucky to have Chris with us. So welcome to the show, Chris. It's nice to have you here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, great. And we have a question here for you to start off with about the healthcare changes in the legislation area, and it's through a PPACA. Tell us what those initials mean, first of all.
Yeah, that's certainly a mouthful to spit out. PPACA is much better known as the Healthcare Reform Act. Its formal name is the Patient Protection and Affordability Care Act, and really the thing that both pharmaceutical manufacturers and medical device companies are most concerned with in that act as it pertains to them, and things that they need to do additionally beyond the consumer responsibilities they have are many of the disclosure provisions that are in that act. When you think about transparency bills, the good news for those manufacturers is there's quite a track record out there from the state level of what the government expects of these manufacturers. There's currently 8 states that have this kind of legislation on the books that's in the Sunshine provision, which is a portion of the Healthcare Reform Act. Within that provision, there really are 3 different aspects of it. There's a code of ethics, there's specific limitations on what you can do, and then finally disclosure. And disclosure is really the forefront of the legislation, and so much as the government has mandated that any transfer of value, whether it be monetary or otherwise being a meal or airfare or lodging, that's paid to a healthcare practitioner, a physician, or a teaching institution needs to be reported on an annual basis. So each individual incidence that's over $10 in value, up until it reaches $100 in aggregate and over, needs to be reported annually to the government. And in the past, there have been regulations at the state level that have been similar. The federal government has made this obviously much broader. Now that there's a million healthcare prescribers in the U.S., there's a lot of people that need to be covered. And they've also put some teeth behind the law. There's a fine of $10,000 per incidence that's not reported that needs to be paid. So with a million potential customers out there, having many meals and engaging with them as consultants and as part of advisory boards, you can imagine there's lots of opportunity, frankly, just for something to be missed, and therefore, obviously, opportunity for pretty substantial fines to be levied.
What was the genesis, or why did they feel there needed to be disclosure?
Yeah, certainly the genesis from the public outcry is really to make sure that there's nothing improprietary going on or no undue influence between folks that are making pharmaceuticals and medical devices and ultimately the people that are able to prescribe those drugs. So it's very common practice within the industry to have consulting agreements with physicians for very valid and legitimate reasons, such as helping to go through product development, to be principal investigators on clinical trials, all things that, like I say, are very legitimate business activities. But in any business, you can imagine there's potential opportunity for those kinds of agreements to be used otherwise. So the government really wants to make sure that there's good transparency into the business dealings that the pharmaceutical and medical device industry is having with physicians, to make sure that any sorts of transfers of value, any money that's exchanged, is done for perfectly legitimate reasons and ultimately to progress healthcare and not to influence prescribing patterns. The other reason that's less spoken is there's certainly a hope that it'll drive down healthcare costs. There's no question about that. It's somewhat interesting, though, when you look at the number of physicians that are in the U.S., that million number that I've cited before, and you think about what it takes to be able to collect all of that data, to be able to categorize it, to be able to report it, it's certainly not an easy task. It's not something that's done lightly, and it takes a lot of forethought, and that cost is going to go somewhere. So there's no question about that.
Yeah, no doubt. So my wife's a clinical pharmacist, so I guess she's used to when the drug reps would come in and wine and dine them, and I guess you really said, hey, they're really curbing that.
It's certainly, the days of whining and dining, in all honesty, really ended in the mid-'90s. That's been gone for quite a while. But what will be new for people like your wife is one of the provisions as part of Sunshine in the federal legislation is not only do you have to report this information, you need to gather it, you need to categorize it, you need to report it to the government annually. You also need to give the opportunity for the people that you're reporting this spend on, who are called covered recipients in the legislation, like your wife, give them the opportunity to spend 45 days with that data to say, yes, I agree with this, or, hey, wait a minute, I wasn't at that speaking program that you've reported me on. to give them that opportunity to dispute it and then to take corrective action on it before you actually submit it to the government. So she'll have some interesting conversations potentially upcoming with those companies.
How is this affecting the general industry?
Yeah, the industry, quite interestingly enough, is a little bit fractured in how it's affecting them. Within our industry, when you've seen and the public has seen these really large fines levied, where you see a $2 billion fine levied against Pfizer for infractions around Bextra, you see a $700 million fine levied against Eli Lilly for marketing improprieties in Colorado. Those things are all done under usually the anti-kickback statutes or the False Claims Act. And what happens in those is the Department of Justice really tries to go through and follow the money and understand what money and what transactions and what interactions have happened with customers. And when they do that, in addition to putting the fine in place on these companies, they also generally have them sign what's called a CIA, or a Corporate Integrity Agreement. And under that agreement, these companies are often faced with doing the same exact thing the Sunshine provision is forcing them to do, to track all the spend that they have with their customers and then to report it annually. They only have to report it to the Department of Justice. They don't have to post it publicly available in all instances. So companies that are under CIA within the industry have publicly come out and not surprisingly supported the Sunshine Act. Why? Because they already are doing much of it today. They're going through a lot of the rigor and the processes today, and they just have very little incremental work to do and therefore very little incremental cost to be able to close that gap. Companies that aren't under CIAs today haven't gone as far as to come out publicly and disagree with the Sunshine Act, but they certainly haven't signed letters of endorsement saying that they agree with it either.
Well, when have the provisions already gone in effect? Like they need to be already reporting on these?
Right. So the law was signed obviously earlier last year. The first date where pharmaceutical and med device companies need to actually start collecting data is January 1 of 2012. So that's the first time they actually have to have a mechanism in place to be able to capture all the spend and categorize it. And their first report is due the following January of 13. The first actual report that the public will see will be in September of 13, and then in subsequent years it'll be published every June.
Okay.
There's better clarity to this and transparency. How do you see this affecting the consumer in any other way?
Yeah, I think the fact of the matter is the data that's been available for the 8 states that have laws on the book, interestingly enough, consumers don't spend a lot of time looking at that. Really what we see spending a lot of time is much more media outlets spend time looking at it and doing analysis, and you see a lot of public shamings that come out of that. You certainly see articles in the Wall Street Journal and in other major outlets talking about the amount of money that's being spent by particular companies on particular physicians or a particular subset of physicians, and drawing correlations on if those interactions are legitimate or if there's improprieties going on there. So I think the two things that we'll ultimately see from a consumer point of view is, one, we'll actually, I think, see some better education within consumers on what it takes to do some of the things that the pharmaceutical industry does. One of the things that will be reported once products become commercially available is the clinical trial payments that went to physicians to organize a trial, recruit patients, set up different sites that these patients can be treated according to the protocol for this new drug. All of that will be reported, and those are quite expensive. You could imagine if you've got 1,000 patients in a trial and it's being run in multiple countries, when you have patients in a trial, you're really treating a patient. It's giving them health care. So they can cost in the tens of millions of dollars. They'll see payments in the tens of millions of dollars to physicians and may initially think, oh, that's a ton of money that they're giving to those physicians for quote-unquote nothing. Right. I think there'll be an education process around certain things like that, around what's actually happened. It's really providing health care for folks in an experimental manner through those clinical trials. The other thing that I think we'll see is the government has also mandated that companies need to disclose the number of samples that they provide to physicians in addition to the amount of money that they give to them. So samples, it's widely known, are used, often given to prescribers at their request to then distribute to patients to get them started on therapies or as a bridge to get their prescription. I'm sure we've all had the experience of going to our doctor and needing a prescription for an antibiotic or whatever it may be, and they give you a prescription and they also give you some samples to get started until that prescription can get filled. With the transparency into how many samples are being given out, companies will certainly start to think a little bit more about how they use those samples and how they actually disperse them, and whether or not to, based frankly on how the public reacts to having